Welcome to the Washington Psychiatric Society's second Wednesday of the month continuing medical education event. I'm Dr. Matt Rudolpher, chair of the WPS CME committee. Happy to see everyone. Sorry for the delay. We are thrilled this evening that we can look no further than our own backyard to have an expert in the timely area of disaster psychiatry for this evening's workshop in the person of Dr. E. Cameron Richie. Dr. Richie is a forensic psychiatrist with special expertise in military and veterans issues. She's been chief of psychiatry at MedStar Washington Hospital Center since 2018 and is professor of psychiatry at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, Georgetown University, and George Washington University. Dr. Richie retired from the Army in 2010, having held multiple leadership positions in Army medicine, including service in hotspots around the globe, including Iraq, Somalia, and Cuba. She trained at Harvard, GW, Walter Reed, and Uniformed Services University, and completed fellowships in forensic and preventive and disaster psychiatry. She's had over 250 publications spanning the areas of forensic, disaster, suicide ethics, and military combat psychiatry and women's health issues. Cam is co-chair of the Military and Veterans Committee for the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, and bringing it back home, currently serves as chair of the WPS Disaster Committee. Take it away, Dr. Richie.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. And as Enrico said, we kind of had a disaster of a beginning for disaster psychiatry, technical issues. And one of the bottom lines there is in disaster situations, often technology does not work. Power is often out. So you have to go back to your basic skill set at times. So I'm going to cover a lot of different topics tonight, and we're starting late. So we're going to go over a little bit. If you have to leave, do so. This is being recorded. These are the objectives, and those are we're put in the objectives. You should pre-plan before the disaster comes, do a needs assessment, and your response is going to change over time. Background of this is back in about 2000, we were concerned that psychological debriefings may be doing more harm than good. That was a CISD, critical incident stress debriefing, where everybody got in the room and talked about what had happened to them and how the shooter had shot their friend and how they had crawled under the desk. And we were worried that was doing more harm than good. We held a conference, we being the military, Department of Justice, the Red Cross, the VA, the Uniformed Services University was well represented and has continued to have the flag on this. We held a conference in October 2001. And remember, that was when planes were barely flying. We put out a book through NIMH a year later. And now, finally, much of that has been adopted and used the term under psychological first aid, which we'll touch on briefly here today. A few more publications, and then just last week I received in the mail the new Mass General Handbook, which has an updated chapter by Co and myself on disaster psychiatry, and I'm in the middle of reviewing a book by on disaster psychiatry readiness by Co, Katz, and Brenner and Stoddard. Excuse me, Brenner, Katz, and Stoddard. And so, I'm not going to talk about too much of what's in that book because it's not out yet, but it informs some of the information. A couple background terms: disasters differ from each other. Natural disasters, of which we're seeing a lot recently, are a combination of a man-made and natural disaster. There's terrorist events, complex humanitarian emergencies, war, and weapons of mass destruction, or what we in the military called CBRNE, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear events. We're going to focus today really on the mass violence and early intervention because we don't have time to do them all. However, in any disaster, you want to do an assessment of what the needs are first. Don't just rush in there with your chaplains and your social workers and yourself and go around talking to people. Find out what the needs are. Often in the beginning of a disaster, people don't want to talk to you. They want to do the rescue mission. And then after 24, 48, 72 hours, you settle into the mission of finding the bodies and mental health issues. And you want to do a needs assessment and individual, group, population. You'll see a fair amount of 911 photos on here. That's still my big disaster that I worked as a Pentagon. You want to think about vulnerable populations, mentally ill, physically ill, disabled, elderly, children. I think it's kind of a toss-up as to whether homeless is more vulnerable or less because they're used to living without and doing without and being on the street. But certainly you want to think about them, especially if you have your chronically mentally ill who are homeless, who come off of medications. So the basics first, what are the physical needs, numbers affected, how much shelter they have, how much food they have, are they wounded or ill, infectious diseases. Less of a problem in the US, but certainly problems in the rest of the world. Look at tsunami, look at many other disasters. What are your psych meds and other medications available? Fuel, both for heat and for cooking. Continued violence. Our model used to be there's going to be one big event and then it was going to be peaceful and calm. That is in many cases not the case. There will be a suicide bomb when rescuers run in, then the second bomb will go off. So you have to be evaluating for that. Not you as a psychiatrist, but you as a part of the checklist. And then are there mass fatalities? Again, the mental health needs assessment, vulnerable population. We have many people in this area who are from other countries where torture was widespread. They may be extra sensitive. And I say may because in many of these, there's not good research on it. Research is hard to do in a disaster. So, but I would think that if you have been tortured in a prison in Syria, that you'd be more susceptible. Then what are your psychiatric medications? Where are psychiatric meds kept in Washington, D.C.? Well, I'm not taking questions now, so whoever knows the answer can put it in the chat, but I'll give you a hint. It's a beautiful new hospital that's east of the river. And then how many hospital beds do you have? We're always short on psych beds in the city. Whether you're going to expect an influx, probably not right away, but later on, if people come off their medications. And then dead bodies are generally not an infectious disease risk, but they are psychological toxin. So if you're seeing bodies rotting in the streets, that's going to be a problem. Okay, there's several different models of sending people in or using locals. After Katrina, we used a model led by SAMHSA of sending teams in, which had its pluses and minuses. If you are a member of one of those teams, try to get as much information before you get there, because likely power will be down and you won't have access to the internet. And by the way, bring extra juice for your cell phone. You want to do an on-the-ground assessment. Sometimes this is called a windshield survey because you're just going through and you're talking to who's ever available. Sometimes that's all you can do. Talk to schools, hospitals, clergy, leaders, shelters. Psychometric assessments are probably not useful. It's hard to do research in a disaster. As I said before, people don't like having a clipboard stuck in their face asking them how they felt about their death of their dog or their mother. And I know I'm going fairly quickly, but there's a lot of material here. And again, put questions or comments in the chat and other people will be monitoring the chat. What are your mental health resources? The traditional ones, Red Cross, crisis counseling. What are your counseling centers, clinics, hospitals? Again, what are your medications? And if we have the bridges blown up to get from one side of the river to the other of the Anacostia, well, we may not be able to get to that stockpile. And language and culture, there's mixed opinions about whether it's better for the first folks to be part of that culture. They know the people, they know the lay of the land, but on the other hand, they may be overwhelmed themselves if they're worried about their family members being safe. The assessment needs to be ongoing. There's usually a honeymoon period right away. The governor comes, the presidents come, and media. But then the floods have still destroyed their house and everybody's left and they've still got to clean up. Often they'll turn to anger at the government, and we certainly saw that in Katrina with intense anger at FEMA, and the cleanup period is tedious and dangerous. I find international issues on this topic fascinating. Again, we'll just touch on them today. There's not a good way to do mental health needs, although Yup Yang has done some good writing, and World Health Organization has stuff on their websites. Infectious agents have their own dynamics. And as I was putting this together and updating it, I was thinking about the similarities and the difference between classic WMD, weapons of mass disruption, often rather than destruction, and the similarities between that and COVID. So numbers of exposed, often we don't know who's been exposed. We saw that with anthrax. What is their infectivity, numbers presenting for care, numbers not presenting for care, and then issues around quarantine, which we've seen in the past, and SARS, and more recently, of course, COVID, and the economic fallout of that. So psychological effects of weapons of mass destruction: see Bernie, invisible, odorless, ubiquitous, uncertainty, novelty, unfamiliarity. In some cases, like smallpox, the grotesqueness. So COVID, and COVID's a whole nother talk. I'm not gonna try to tackle it today, but it has some similarity: invisible, ubiquitous symptoms, uncertainty, no longer novel. So a little word about disaster behaviors. And I am a big believer in drills, muscle memory, because if you practice how to get out of the metro when it has stopped and you're stuck underground, you're more likely to be organized, less likely to panic. For first responders, a question becomes, do I go make sure my family is safe first, or do I go for the mission first? I know I had that on 9/11. I wanted to make sure my kids were safe before I went out to Reed to wait for the wounded, which didn't come there. They came to a hospital center. Social disarray, we saw that in Katrina. If there's short lifeboats, antibiotics, vaccine, whatever, there may be arguments over it. And we've certainly seen that in COVID. And then sensory overload, dead bodies, mass destruction. And then acute psychiatric issues, stress, fear of unknown. The term worried well, I don't like at all, because if you're worried that you've been exposed, you may be worried, but you're not well. It's not like it's your imagination. You may have been exposed. And there's often the fear of passing exposure along to your family. And again, we saw that in COVID. Changes in mental status secondary to agents. The 75th anniversary of NATO is in town right now. Are we going to get some Russian poisons like Novichok, which are going to target folks? And then they're going to come, Novichok, apparently that's a version of the nerve agent that the Russians have been using. It apparently doesn't act right away, so the assassins have time to get away before the person bowls over. They have constricted pupils, so do we think it's just an opioid overdose? Triaging, whether we try to get them to the ER or try to get them to stay home. Quarantine, reversal isolation. Again, these we've seen a lot of in recent years. Then long-term psychiatric issues, depression, PTSD, fears that your body has been harmed, overreactions, anger at the government. After the first Gulf War, we called it MUPS, multiple unexplained physical symptoms. Then economic fallout, which traditionally targets the people most, not all, but most at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Often they're in tourism or hotel industries that are affected. And unemployment traditionally is linked to domestic violence and suicide. So there's a lot of possible fallout. So what can we do about it? This is, again, as I was saying in the beginning, but some of you may have missed it. We had a conference looking at psychological debriefings, and we found that those could be useful in some cases, but let's start with the basics. Basics are safety, security, survival. knowing where you're going to sleep that night, knowing where you're going to get a meal, orientation, knowing that your family's okay. Psychological first aid has now really become a thing, which is great. And it's taught to a lot of people who aren't psychiatrists, so you have a wider workforce. Support for distress, keeping families together, facilitating reunion, providing information, that's really, really important. Even if you don't have any new information, to say, I don't have any new information. Protect from further harm. Again, in wartime, that's harder to do. Reduce physiological arousal when you can. This is something we forget about sometimes, and we as psychiatrists definitely have a role here. Often people from the outside will come in wanting to help who may actually be predatory on the affected individuals. There can be toxin. We saw that in the pilot in New York. There are ongoing threats, and see that the services that are being provided are provided appropriately. Lots of people want to descend to help. Outreach, information, dissemination. That is, with 9/11, we did therapy by walking around, using established structures such as churches and schools, flyers, website, but remember, often the power may be down. By the way, for those who can recognize him, that's Dave Benedict with me in Iraq some years back. And I assume we have some sus people on here who are military district branch. I'm hoping we do, so that's for their benefit. Technical assistance, here again is where it is so important to have developed relationships beforehand. If after the riot happens, you go to Mayor Bowser and say, oh, I know how to help, and she doesn't know you from a hole in the ground, then she's going to turn to her trusted providers. So you want to be active with your local community, however you define it, in advance. I think we at Hospital Center do a very good job of that under the leadership of Craig Diatley. He has had many exercises and outreach to the DC area. And so that's a model to emulate. Now, if that's for general disasters and Ebola, it's not the mental health sides of it, but it means that we as a community are known. And I'm going to circle back to what you can do for your environment when I can. Fostering resiliency, that's such a buzzword. At one point in the DoD, there were something like 264 programs that promoted resiliency. But what can you actually do to do that? I like potlucks, and I like happy hours, and I like other ways that people can get together and talk. Softball games are good too, although I don't play softball. How do you foster natural social support? Then looking after the bereaved, not just right away, but 6 months later and a year later. And then finally, operational debriefings can be useful when they are something that are normally done, usually in responder organizations, police, fire, the emergency department. But what we encourage people to do is keep them brief, not go into a lot of what actually happened to who, but rather focus on what we did well and what we can do better next time. Triage. Now, this is important for us as psychiatrists, because this is what we know how to do, and we know how to refer, identifying their vulnerable groups, and in some cases, emergency hospitalization, as we do now. And then individual and family therapy, group pharmacotherapy, spiritual support. And back to hospitalization, major disasters disrupt the flow of psychiatric medication. You remember Katrina, where the shelters became very dangerous places to be in because everybody was off their medications. Fortunately, most of the disasters around here so far haven't disrupted medication supply, but we've got a summer ahead of us. Couple words about interventions for CBRNE. The most important is good risk communication. And we see that when it's blown, love canal, we see that when it works well. One of the things that really helped with anthrax was when we realized we could treat it with antibiotics. And the East Coast kind of let out a collective sigh of relief. Okay, so that's the early interventions, and that information has, I think, changed the way that disasters are responded to. I'm going to come out to a few key points, and then I think I'm doing okay on time. Again, a lot of information in a short period of time. So this is a book chapter we just published with updates to emphasize it's an evolving field that's developed in response to severe and unpredictable events. Here's something that we should think about. What is our role? We have lots of different roles: uh, preparation, policy, advocacy, and our function may change according to the phase of the disaster. In the beginning phase, we may go in and help carry stretchers or do whatever needs to be done. And that's a good way to bond with the first responder community, get to know people, and then always keep a pair of gloves in your car in case you have to carry those stretchers. And when 9/11 happened, I was in my uniform with heels on. That wasn't good for carrying stretchers. So I always recommend a pair of boots in your car too. Disaster psychiatry involves interfacing with multiple systems. There's a variety of both normal and pathological responses. We should be prepared to educate communities about normal responses, assist with triage, and provide treatment for individuals with pathological symptoms. There are numerous treatment modalities. This isn't a one-size-fits-all: psychological first aid, psychopharmacology, and provision of individual and group psychotherapy. One thing to think about when you're developing what your disaster toolkit should be is you've got the needs, as I've emphasized before, of the chronic and severely mentally ill, but you may want to find more sedatives than normal or antidepressants for your first responders who may go out there and work for 3 days and then can't go to sleep because they can't get those images out of their head. So I would be a little bit more liberal, although always in a safe manner, with the sedatives than I might be normally. And think about the pre-existing community structure. If your mental health resources were thin and strained before the disaster, it's probably going to be thin and strained afterwards. And that's, again, where if you can use other schools and churches to provide support, that will really amplify your bandwidth. Special populations, we've mentioned before, high-risk victims of disasters, the nursing homes where they couldn't evacuate when the water was rising with Hurricane Katrina, or COVID. I hate keeping coming back to COVID, but it just kind of creeps itself in there. We can help facilitate the normal recovery process with an emphasis on that normally most do recover, but it may take a little while to get there. I wanted to say a word about the attempt by the Uniformed Services University. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I'd made this dark, so it's hard to read. This is Dave Benedict, Josh Morgenstein, folks over at the Uniformed Services University, and a number of others. They have a free 8-hour online course, which you can take there. And there's a lot of material. Personal and family preparedness, communication, ethical and legal issues, which we haven't covered today, and it's designed to be taken in pieces. One of the things I was thinking about, which I haven't gotten there yet, but we're looking for grand round speakers periodically, could be using some of these modules for our grand round speakers. And then this is a framework to which to build disaster behavioral health curricula and compile and give access to up-to-date credible resources. Another thing that the Uniformed Services University has is called the Center for Traumatic Stress. And they have a variety of materials on their website that can be customized to, say, whatever your particular disaster is. So you're not trying to reinvent the wheel and creating this, you just sort of put your name and logo on it. So coming back to you, what will you do? What is your role when disaster strikes? And this is a map that I borrowed from Craig Diatley. It's going to be hard to read, I know, but these are the different hospitals in the region. How, if you're hospital based, how will you be interacting with other hospitals. If you're clinic-based, who are you going to go, if you're going to go volunteer, who are you going to volunteer with? We have a pretty active disaster preparedness, and this is an example of what we in behavioral health at Hospital Center are supposed to do in our drills. We have bags, which are orange command bags, and we keep 3 of them with pencils and clipboards and flashlights, and one of them has an orange vest that says leader, so that's the person in charge. We call the hospital command center to let them know who is doing what and finding out who's in the medical and surgical holding areas. Remember, if power is down, the regular phones won't work. We have some special lines that are supposed to work without power, but to be honest, I don't know if I know how to use them. We used to use radios when I was at DBH. We had radios. I found with radios, if you don't use them, nobody knows how to use them. They're not charged. So a lot of things to think about. Then if there is, say, a mass influx of patients, triage the inpatients and assign people to the emergency department, the family assistance center, and BERT teams, which are behavioral emergency response team. Coordinate with the casualty care unit leader, remind staff on documentation, see if you need to call in more staff. Usually we're not needed right away. And that's a big take-home lesson, that right away, other things are going on. It's rescue, it's the emergency room. Later is when we'll be needed. Call, advise, I think you can read the best of it. Again, if power is out, you're gonna have to use pen and paper. And so you wanna have some way to do that. And then we have a code orange playbook for additional response information. And all these slides will be available on, I don't know what they'll be available on, but WPS will make them available or send them to you if you want to crosswalk with what your disaster. And I'm sure all the hospitals have their own disaster plan, but often behavioral health is not remembered. And again, very important to be at the table when the desktops and other operations are happening. I have a lot of lessons learned, and we don't have time, I don't think, for most of them. I do want to talk about the Family Assistance Center after 9/11 as one example, and I want to talk about that both because I think that we very well might be asked to set up a Family Assistance Center, and also because, at least for me, and I suspect for most of the psychiatrists in this room over 40, 9/11 was a big event for us. So after 9/11, there were going to be 3 family assistance centers, one for each service, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and one at the Dulles. But Dulles was in total disarray, and so we consolidated at the Sheraton in Crystal City. And at that time, there actually wasn't very much in the literature about setting up a family assistance center. There's a lot more now. National Safety Transportation Board has a lot of it because of train accidents and plane accidents. So if in doubt and you're asked to participate in one, you can go there. And of course, we didn't know whether we were at war. I was at the Bureau of Medicine across from the Pentagon. Looked over right after it was hit, saw it burning, didn't know where to go, what to do. As I mentioned, reported to Walter Reed, and then the next day I went into the Pentagon to help coordinate the effort there. I was there for the next 3 weeks. Some issues that came up. We expected a lot of wounded to the local hospitals. There were only a handful. I think it was 7 burn patients who came to Hospital Center. And most of the rest walked themselves to the hospital. They set up a medical clinic in the courtyard, which is in the middle of the Pentagon, and then set up the Family Assistance Center. And it was much better consolidated because you could get all the services in one place. One rule of thumb is for every victim, assume about 10 family members, which includes Uncle Bob, who came without his diabetes medication, and grandchildren age 2 or 3, who you don't have anybody to watch, but their mother needed to come and she didn't have anybody to watch the kids. And so these are the services we put in place. Most of them are obvious. DNA collection was done there, and the Armed Forces Medical Examiner helped with that. And again, in a big accident, you're probably going to have similar services to this. Again, emphasis on putting out information, and at the Sheraton, which is the one you drive by when you're on Route 1 going into Arlington, Crystal City. It's good to have a hotel because you can put a perimeter about it, and you can provide food and shelter and do everything within there without, and you can keep the media out and or let them in as appropriate. That was a combined area. One thing we did then and afterwards, which still isn't perfect, is a lot of people wanted to come in and help, but if they weren't licensed in Virginia, could they help in Virginia? No. And there was discussion for a while with Dan Dodgen and others to try to get licenses to be able to be used across state lines. There's a lot of reasons that that hasn't gone too far. A couple of issues that you may not have thought about. The human remains of the victims were commingled with the hijackers. Nobody wanted to bury the hijackers at Arlington Cemetery. So how did you get an honorable burial without putting the hijackers in with our sacred soldiers? Then issues about being buried at Arlington. You have to be a certain connection with the military, and a lot of people whose families weren't part of the military wanted them to be buried there, but they weren't eligible. Progress. And then the military has casualty notification officers and casualty assistance officers who were overwhelmed. And we know how to do that. We do that in victims of war, but usually that will be ones and twos, not all at once. And then long-term response. This is very hard because you can do this. We did this for the first 30 days, and we thought that we would track, or the Red Cross would track after people went back home. I don't know that that happened in a very real way. Memorial services are really important. I was there at the 30-day memorial service. Nobody took our services. And then we've continued to have services after 9/11, 1 year and 10 years after. So a couple of the lessons learned from this is a single place to provide the Family Assistance Center. One thing we did not do a very good job is thinking about the needs of the staff there, you know, the people who clean the rooms and who cook the meals. This was very intense for them, having this concentrated period of grief and mourning. We did do some other things well. We had service dogs and massage therapists and good informational briefing. And that's another good thing about the hotel. Having multiple breakout rooms is helpful. And the importance of memorial ceremonies is critical. If you haven't been to the Pentagon Memorial, it is open to the public. This is fairly soon after it opened. Each bench represents a victim. The ones pointed into the Pentagon were on the plane. The one the other direction were in the Pentagon. And we were very lucky. The area that the plane hit was a new area, which had just been recently reinforced, and most people hadn't moved back into there. So it could have been a lot worse. The speculation was that the hijackers were heading for the middle, for the courtyard, and if they had hit there rather than the outside wall off of the road, it would have been a lot worse. So I'm going to wrap up here. I have more lessons learned I can talk about if that I have in the backup slides, but I think we should go to the chat and see if we don't have much of the chat, I can cover a couple more as well. So time phase planning, risk communication, environmentally monitoring, ongoing health assessment of the first responders, of the victims, family assistance center, and just taking care of yourself and taking care of each other, which is important in all settings, but especially so here. Okay, Who can tell me what's on the chat?
I don't see anything in the chat, but a question that I had is, for the residents in the Zoom right now, is there any thoughts on opportunities to get involved and learn more about disaster psychiatry while in residency? Whether it's, the textbook sources and, more talks like this, or even maybe getting involved and seeing some of these disaster drills in the hospitals that we rotate at.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I couldn't see who was talking, but it sounded a little like Kelly.
It was me. It was Kelly.
So I'm glad you asked that question. There is a disaster psychiatry meeting at the APA, and I actually hadn't been there for some years, got taken there this time, said, who is a disaster psychiatry rep from WPS? And got some blank looks and emailed back to you, Enrico, and Anne Marie, and said, can I be the disaster psychiatry rep? And they kind of said, okay. Uh, so that's two opportunities. The talk on the Uniformed Services University. I don't know very much about Georgetown's disaster psychiatry plan. So I think part of this talk is just to raise an awareness and look around and see what you got and see where the gaps are.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I was wondering, Dr. Richie, if you can comment. We talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, right? And negative outcomes in terms of mental health. There is also post-traumatic growth. And there can be post-traumatic growth after disasters. I wondering if you, based on your experience, can comment on that.
Absolutely. There's been actually a lot of work done on post-traumatic trauma or post-traumatic growth after war trauma disasters. And I think there's a few aspects of that. One piece is that we, in general, I believe we do better when we're helping others, and there's often major opportunities to help others here. I do better when I'm working as a team. And again, I've found that you have teams of just absolutely dedicated people. You may find that you relish life more, and because you see how easily it can be lost. And I try to remember that every day. So I think that those are three of the ways. Enrico, you probably have some thoughts on that yourself.
Well, I do think that there is I can see how a experience of a traumatic experience can lead people to rethink about their life, their values, their relationships in positive terms. I have never experienced it myself, or have been in a situation like that where I was a provider. But I think it's a very interesting aspect in this that gives us hope, right? And I was wondering if you have seen it yourself as a provider in disaster situations, if you've been around enough to be able to appreciate, post-traumatic growth.
So one challenge with this field is that there's just not good research in much of the areas. I don't know of well, I could look before I say for sure that there isn't. I think there's a lot of anecdotal people who feel good about themselves. And we did do some survey information. We worked with the Hope, the Navy ship that went to the tsunami, and we did a little bit of survey research with the providers on there, but we asked them how well they were prepared. I don't think we asked them about post-traumatic growth. And again, everybody defines that differently. But if there's a resident who's looking for a research project, this might be a good one to think about, because we're going to have so many disasters this coming summer with all the climate changes. I think it might be worthwhile designing something in advance. But again, the utility of, you could probably, I'm contradicting myself here because I'm thinking about it. You could probably do something with the providers afterwards where they had a 30-day after and a 60-day and a 90-day after, and specifically to assess that. And that could be a pretty cool project.
Yeah, when I was in my child psychiatry fellowship, there was an epidemiologist at Columbia University who was working with in Africa with former children soldiers and looking at post-traumatic growth. So if one looks around, there are probably opportunities to do a research project on that.
And this is a little weird because I'm seeing 4 faces on the screen. I don't know who else is out there. And I see Tyler McGee raise his hand.
Yeah, I do apologize. I missed some of the presentation at the beginning. I just had a question about what these, when you actually implement a disaster strategy and you're having these group sessions, what do these group sessions look like? Who are they primarily run by? Are they focused more on supportive therapy or actual presentations? Is it just anything and everything of what you can get? Or is there really structured plans in place that we should have?
So at the beginning, I talked about critical incident stress debriefings and how we've really moved away from doing that. If you were going to do, because of the vicarious re-traumatization, if you were going to do a group, I would do the assessment first. If you have, say, military who have served together and worked together and know each other, group therapy may be very helpful. And I've found with soldiers, at least, a lot of people, I'm fine, but my buddy over here. And so they'll do a lot of helping each other. But I wouldn't do it with take a group of strangers and put them all together in a room and try to do group therapy.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, thank you all very much. I think I did a good job of getting us through the shortened time. A lot of these topics could be their own hour-long talk in themselves. And again, for that, I'd refer you to the Uniformed Services curriculum as a place where you can take the classes for yourself at your own pace. And I think they offer CME, I'm not 100% sure. To my buddies from the Society for Uniformed Services Psychiatry, it's good to see you again. For everybody from WPS. And I guess one final thought, if anybody's interested in being on the WPS Disaster Committee, which consists at the moment of myself, just let me know and we can go from there.